we've set a culture in this organization that's very much centered around honoring our commitments. We hold every member of the team accountable to the forecast. Over the last 20 years, I think the pressure around forecasting has increased significantly, largely driven by the computing transformation to cloud and the introduction of the subscription model under software as a service or SaaS. Companies now have a need to be much more precise on not only the forecasting of bookings and top line growth, but also overall revenue. And so the pressure around that, I think, has continued to increase and elevate. I think the need to be able to do that at a higher frequency because of the nature of cloud has also created more pressure. So organizations, best-in-class organizations, have made that shift and are no longer looking at annual or quarterly forecasts, but truly looking at monthly forecasts and managing each month as a previous quarter end close.
Awesome. Okay. And Joe, we were talking before about how forecasting has basically changed and evolved, and that's because of cloud evolving as well. Could you talk me through that really quickly?
Sure. Yeah, I think the democratization of data and the accessibility of technology through CRM systems, order management systems, and everything that's happening from the buyer's perspective online has enabled us to be able to look at many more signals that can be indicative of where a buyer is in their journey and give us more accuracy around the forecasting of a given pursuit. So the accessibility of all of this has ultimately created inputs into forecasting algorithms that would allow us to identify behavioral trends that are indicative of sales that are about to occur. Because the volume of data that's accessible to us now has increased exponentially over the last few years, we now have the ability to use that data to have a very scientific view around how behavioral signals are ultimately driving the outcomes that we're pursuing on given opportunities that are built into the forecast.
That reminds me of a quote that I came across before, which is like, data is the new currency. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, yes, so Joe, right. I'd be really interested to hear about forecasting methods. What forecasting methods are you using and why did you choose it?
Sure. We actually use several different forecasting methodologies. And the reason for that is we look for triangulation. So we're using forecast categories to help us determine where a given deal might sit in a given quarter and what the risk profile of that deal is. We use weighted and unweighted views of the pipeline to be able to determine where a given pursuit is in the scoring of that pursuit based on the criteria we're using to move opportunities through the sales process. And then we're also using, as I talked about, data. We're using statistical information about historical performance, but also current data and the signals that we're receiving from sellers and buyers to be able to predict outcomes. So we use all of that to triangulate, in addition to having a multi-level forecasting methodology, so that we can best assess where there's variance and use that variance in order to determine the risk profile on a given financial period.
Awesome. Okay. And you sound like you have a very complex system. Who do you think is responsible for that forecast number given up? And on the flip side, who's then in the firing line if things are going wrong or if it's misleading?
Sure. Ultimately, we're all responsible for it. And when I say that, it's every sales athlete on the team, every coach that's part of my team, and myself. But it's also the company. We ultimately all are responsible for making sure that we can perform against the growth numbers that we have and play a role in that. So whether you're in professional services, customer success, support on the product team, all of us who are interfacing with customers have an input that can be leveraged to help us determine the forecast and how realistic that forecast is. So we're all ultimately accountable, and I try to make sure that my teams understand that the precision in their forecast is important, which is reinforced through their compensation plans. So we do have elements of their compensation tied to their ability to forecast accurately. We don't need heroes on the team who are bringing large deals forward on the last day of the quarter that no one knew about. And we also don't need people who are painting a very rosy picture and unable to deliver on the commitment. So we've set a culture in this organization that's very much centered around honoring our commitments, and we hold every member of the team accountable to the forecast.
Awesome. Okay, so is that a way for you to ensure your forecasts have integrity? Like as it passes through the layers, I can imagine, it's going through so many different people's hands. If you're compensating them correctly, it promotes that behavior of like trying to forecast accuracy and not painting that rosy picture.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we have structured it in a way where all layers in the management organization have accountability to the forecast to ensure the integrity of it as it moves through the different layers in the organization. We also look at it from a bottoms up and tops down perspective, which helps us sort of do the right level of inspection and truly ensure that there's no unforeseen risk built into the number.
Awesome. Okay, so Joe, when we spoke before, we mentioned about how there's an art and a science to sales and forecasting, and like you going through that just reminds me of that conversation. To what extent would you say your forecasting is built for visibility versus tactics?
Yeah, I think the forecast ultimately is designed to help give senior leadership a point of view on where the business is going to perform in a given time period, so you can make strategic investment decisions and also execute on tactical plans. So it's really important that you get it accurate, and that you have as far in advance of a view of where a given quarter is going to be as possible. Some of that is driven by science. So there's a lot of data, as I mentioned earlier, that we can leverage to help us get an informed point of view on where we're likely to finish in a future quarter. But part of it is art too, because you have to factor in the human element of what happens in sales. You have buyers who have changing priorities, or organizations that have changing budgets. You have sellers that come and go within an organization. All of those things have an impact on your ability to deliver on the forecast. And so you have to factor some of that in based on what you know about the individuals that are a part of your team and the customers to whom you're selling to.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And do you think, with a forecast, do you think that if there's like some companies tend to go towards using it for visibility and then some use it more for tactics? Does it just depend on the stage that the company's at, do you think? Or is it quite like 50-50 in what the forecast does?
It probably depends a little bit on stage, and then also the audience. If you're a privately held company and you're working with an investment community, there may be some elements of visibility that the forecast is driving. But in terms of internal operation, a lot of the forecast has to do with helping you execute on your strategic and tactical plans.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, and Joe, could you talk me through you and your ops team? What would you say the relationship is between you and sales ops or rev ops, where the forecast is, like we're talking about forecast in this situation? What would you say the relationship is there?
Yeah, it's a very close relationship. So the operations team is very much my eyes and ears as chief revenue officer, but also the eyes and ears of all the leaders on my team to really get visibility into the forecast with a cadence. And to look for the anomalies. So we run different simulations to really understand where there's weakness in the number, so we can mitigate that. Right. The whole idea is to uncover risk as early as you can and build a mitigation plan around that risk. And so the operations team has been instrumental in helping us understand at scale where those movements are and where those risks are introduced into the number, so that we can contemplate a strategy for how we ultimately cover those risks.
Awesome. Okay, so It sounds like you see a lot of benefit from you as a CRO working closely with your ops team then.
Yes, absolutely. I can't live without them.
Okay, well, I'm really excited about this question, Joe. Can you talk about mistakes or a disaster? So is there a situation where the forecast was wrong? If something went really wrong, what happened? What did you learn? Is there any stories that you would follow with yourself till this day?
Yeah, sure. I would love to say yeah, I have a perfect track record of forecasting with 100% accuracy, but that's not true, and I think that's probably the case for most sales leaders. I've had different roles inside of large publicly traded companies, small startups, and mid-sized private equity held companies throughout my career. And as you work with different teams that have different performance levels, you see variations in their ability to forecast, and certainly deviations from the 100% accuracy that we would like to see. I think in the situations where it was it was the most problematic is where really some of the basics were missing. The ability to control deals through the qualification of the deal, through the alignment with the buyer in their journey, and through the use of things like joint execution plans or mutual execution plans to ensure that we have clarity around the path to close, ultimately led to inaccuracies in the forecast. And so when the right level of inspection around those sort of fundamental parameters is missing, you can certainly have a disaster in a forecast. So has it happened? Absolutely. Have those changes been things that could be remedied in a very short period of time? Yes, they can. And I think if you have the commitment from senior leadership and your frontline managers to embrace the core concepts that are needed to be able to address forecasting accuracy, you can get to a really good outcome really quickly.
Amazing. So, Joe, would you say if you're clear about the route for you and your sales teams to generate revenue, that kind of helps with the forecasting as well, because you know where your teams are winning, and so like if they do these specific things, they're more likely to actually get their number and have that forecast to be accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things we strive to do is to take the subjectivity out of it. Salespeople will inevitably have a biased view on the deals they're forecasting based on the optics, around a given number, based on their quota, based on where they are year to date against their target. At the end of the day, they need to, they need to show that they have a path to success. And so we want to try to remove some of that biased view from the forecast that they're putting forward or from the way they're representing particular deals. So one of the things that you do to mitigate that is that you insert customer verifiable outcomes as criteria into the sales stages as you move opportunities through your sales funnel. So instead of a seller having sort of a subjective view around where a deal sits or what sales stage a deal is in, they have specific criteria that can only be verified by a customer, and with that verification, have the opportunity to move a deal from one stage to the next. So when you do that, you de-risk a bit of the forecast, and you certainly build more accuracy into the number.
That's awesome. That is. Okay, that's great. I've never thought about it like that. I've always thought with reps, if you ask them what's going on, the power's in their hand, if that makes sense. But now you're like de-risking and you're putting the power in the customer's hand, which what it should be like. How do you actually do that in practice, Joe? Like, what does the cadence look like for the rep and the customer?
Yeah, so what we've defined what the customer verifiable outcomes are by stage, and so we have a template that we use to determine where an opportunity would sit. We expect our sellers to be working through the validation of each of those needed outcomes with the customer as part of the sales process and playbook we've created for them. And then we do weekly inspection with our sellers through one-on-ones and through forecast calls to be able to understand what activities have been completed that would support the verifiable outcomes needed to move opportunities from one stage to the next. So are there exceptions and unusual circumstances which might warrant having an opportunity in a different stage, even if we maybe not completed all the verified steps? Yeah, absolutely. You have to have some agility in the way that you do manage the forecast, and that's a little bit where the art comes in. But for the most part, if you stick to the science, you will end up with a very accurate result.